Good afternoon. My name is Mabel Nederlof-Sitole, and I'd like to offer you all a warm welcome to this breakaway session, which will focus on ethical, capable, and enduring institutions. This important discussion is hosted by the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance under the auspices of the University of Cape Town's SDGs Summit. This session and subsequent research activities would not be possible without a number of valuable partners who have contributed to this learning journey. These include the African Union African Peer Review Mechanism, African Governance Architecture, the Democratic Governance and Rights Unit, Graduate School of Public Business, and the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship, and Public Policy at the University of Cape Town, the Open Society Foundation, the Dalla Oma Institute, Institute for Security Studies, Center for Democracy and Development, amongst many others. The Mandela School and our partners convened 2 pre-summit workshops in preparation for the summit. The first workshop interrogated the role of civil society in building resilience against corruption. The second looked at how ethical and responsible leadership and civil society organizations can stimulate the building of capable states, corporate governance, and social transformation in Africa. Although this thematic track relates to the African Union Agenda 2063 and cuts across all 7 aspirations, the theme aligns most closely with Aspiration 3, an Africa of good governance, democratic values, gender equality, respect for human rights, justice, and the rule of law. This thematic track also reflects SDG 16, to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, provide access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. In the review of SDG implementation, key focus areas identified at the High-Level Political Forum in 2019 raised the very issues we have highlighted for discussion in this session. In particular, the importance of building institutional capacity. We have an exciting lineup of speakers who will lead this discussion. The session will start with Professor Brian Raftopoulos, a scholar and activist who is the Mandela School stream leader focusing on democratic governance in Africa. Professor Raftopoulos will provide an overview of our work leading to the summit, as well as a summary of the key issues highlighted in the position paper. Thereafter, our keynote for this session will be delivered by Professor Mushtaq Khan, who will respond to the paper and stress key issues that we need to take cognizance of in developing a collaborative research agenda. We will invite our partners to share thoughts and reactions to Professor Khan's input before opening up the floor for a broader discussion moderated by Ms. Penny Perenzi, who is one of our senior managers at the Mandela School. Professor Faisal Ismail, the director of the Mandela School, will deliver the closing address. Kindly use the Q&A function and the chat to ask questions and provide comments. We value your contributions. At this juncture, I'd like to hand over to Professor Raftopoulos. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mabel, and thank you to all for participating, and to Professor Khan for agreeing to talk to the paper and give his ideas on movement forward. This paper really is a summary of the discussions we had in our 2 workshops in July and August of this year. And it really just tries to bring those ideas that came out of the discussion together. But before we had those 2 workshops, we had a smaller one where we try to set out some of the analytical issues which might guide our movement forward and our analysis. And out of that discussion, there were 4 issues that came out which we thought could help to guide our discussion around this question. The first was the forms of decolonization political settlements that have taken place, particularly in Southern Africa. The second, deracialization of the economy and responses to the structural inequalities of colonial rule. The third, state capture and corruption. And the fourth, struggles for democratization. To go to the first, the question of the forms of political settlement. In this region, particular South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, the political settlements that ended protracted liberation struggles were usually a result of a conjuncture of national, regional, and international pressures, which led to compromises, particularly over deep structural issues. They were mainly about bringing an end to violence and finding a way politically to move a transition forward. It was very difficult in those agreements to try and deal with the longer term structural questions because of the nature of the power of balance and the nature of the type of settlements that were reached. And therefore, these issues came back and have come back to haunt, in a sense, the politics of the post-colonial state. As we saw the land question in Zimbabwe, the problems of poverty and unemployment really throughout the continent. The second, of course, as I said, is the racialization of the economy. Most of these economies, former settler colonies or former apartheid states, the private sector is dominated by a racial elite or multinationals. There was very little room given for the emergence of any kind of a black elite. In the post-colonial period, those limitations, while attempts have been made through Black empowerment, indigenization programs, there's still not much movement in terms of deracializing the ownership of these economies. This leads to the fact that therefore the state then becomes a center of accumulation for the new ruling elite. And this is where we begin to see the corruption, the deep corruption and state capture that we've seen, where the state is used to abuse public resources and to find new ways of accumulation by using state structures. Often in these situations, the state can become a zero-sum game for political players. Those players who are in power see that if they lose state power, they lose access to their accumulation machine. So this becomes a serious problem. And then the question of democratic struggles. One of the key issues we found in terms of fighting back against this deepening corruption is the role of civil society. Of course, the role of civil society is not new they played a role in the anti-colonial struggles, and they've been key in setting benchmarks, in asking questions around state ability throughout the post-colonial period. And so strengthening of these institutions of civil society, these voices, has become absolutely important if we are going to deal in any way with the kind of corruption that we've seen. In our first webinar, where we talked about how African states can build resilience against corruption by strengthening civil society participation and anti-corruption strategies and institutions, a number of recommendations were made. I'll just go through a few of them. That whilst on the continent, there are a hybrid range of anti-corruption institutions, for the most part, they lack the capacity, independence, and resources to carry out the objective. They deeply entrench state corruption of political elites, builds barriers against anti-corruption agencies. Second, there are several good instruments on the continent to fight corruption, such as the African Union Convention on Prevention and Combating Corruption and the Common Position on Asset Recovery. In addition, the UN Convention Against Corruption also provides a potential tool to confront the abuses of corruption. However, regional, continental, and global cooperation on this issue remains quite weak. The third is that there's some research emerging, particularly in West Africa, showing that anti-corruption messaging on its own can reinforce public perceptions that the problem of corruption is so big as to induce apathy in the citizens. In such cases, individuals feel the problem is so overwhelming that it's a better option to pay a bribe rather than to make a stand against agents of corruption. And so to deal with these kind of issues, some of the methods going forward for civil society was suggested included ensuring that civil society groups have a functioning access to reliable information, that they connect not just locally, but globally, that they empower communities to participate in decision-making in order for CSOs to continue to receive the public support that in return improves the capacity for long-term sustainability, and understand and challenge the legal frameworks that are in tackling corruption. When it came to our second workshop around building of capable states, corporate governance, and social transformation, again, we looked at the kind of challenges around state-owned enterprises, where often they lack accountability, they lack any form of, therefore not, even though they're subjected to certain kind of market rules, they don't have the capacity to respond to that. And because of they link to the state and corruption in the state, this often prevents them from providing the services that they should be providing. And that in moving forward, one of the things is to follow the UNDP position of identifying accelerators for development in each country and providing the necessary policy support, a stronger role for private sector in public enterprises within a carefully enforced regulatory role for the state. And in addition, both locally and both capacity and accountability at local government level will need to be given much greater attention in order to avoid the factional and patronage appointments that have denied communities the services they desperately need. So this really is a kind of a summary of our very rich discussions, where we try to, as I said, initiate some kind of analytical frame and then listen to our participants and took their ideas in and summarize them. And going forward, of course, we will add substantially to this in terms of the readings and in terms of further consultation and collaboration with our colleagues on the continent.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that introduction. It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Mushtaq Khan, who is a professor of economics at SOAS in London and has done a lot of research, which many of you, I think, are familiar with, from as far as Asia to Africa. And his specialization includes institutional economics. He has looked at rent seeking and economic development. And today we have the opportunity to hear from him more about his comments on the draft paper and the themes which Brian has so eloquently outlined from the rich discussions that we had. And we will have an opportunity for many of our partners as well to respond. Thank you very much, Professor Khan. You now have the floor.
Thank you for inviting me to this meeting. And I had a look at your draft positioning paper, and I also heard what Brian said with great interest. To start off with, I think that all of the areas and topics that you have identified are extremely important areas, and there is no comment that I can make on their appropriateness because they're super appropriate. I mean, these are exactly the issues that are constraining development not only in Africa, not only in South Africa, but globally across emerging and developing countries. And increasingly, many of the questions that we thought were only limited to developing countries are now of concern in advanced countries. Issues like the rule of law it turns out to be quite vulnerable, even in relatively advanced countries. So I think these issues of governance, of accountability, of development are now genuinely global issues, and they need to be addressed both locally and globally. I think my commentary on this is that while these issues are important, different methodologies of research, different methodologies of social science give very different answers to these questions. And I think the first step that you would have to do in your network going forward is to assess these different answers and take a position on where you think you want to take your own research. And I think that what I didn't get in the position paper, and I'm sure it was deliberate because you don't want to preempt what you're going to do. But I think in the next step, you will have to engage with the massive amount of thinking and research which has been done on exactly these questions and addressing Africa and African conditions, as well as other countries. So these are not new questions. People have been working on them for a very long time, on state capabilities, on developmental states, on corruption, on governance, on rule of law. And there are, as you know, radically different positions on Lenin's question of what is to be done. And because of these differences, we often get trapped in doing a lot of small things which are all equally plausible, but which don't add up to a coherent or consistent position. So I'm going to give you a few thoughts on my own way of thinking about these things, and then provoke you to maybe think in the next round a little bit more about how you want to position your research in terms of what has already been done, how do you want to take it forward, and what can you add to what we know. So here is my own take on some of these questions, which are, I mean, obviously a particular position, and there are alternative positions, which I will not want to spell out in great detail now, but I can if you want to, which take a different position. To me, the point of research is to not just identify what the problems are. So we have a lot of research telling us why there is corruption, why democracy doesn't work, why you have patronage, politics in developing countries, why capabilities are low. That research is very important as a starting point. It doesn't tell us what to do, because many of these problems are overdetermined. They are structural. There are many causes behind them. And because they are multi-causal, you may not be able, just by identifying some of the causes, you may not have a set of instruments that you can reverse and then make the problem disappear. So I think when you are looking at structural problems, and all of the issues that you have identified and I think are really important are structural problems, that means they're not monocausal, that there isn't one factor causing them. So you have to therefore identify, as a kind of policy research agenda, what are the policy instruments that will be both feasible, that is, the policy instrument must itself be feasible to implement, and effective, that is, it will have a reasonable impact on the outcome of interest, whatever it is, and it will be developmental. Here is where the research is really, really challenging, right? Because I think that it's quite easy to say, we don't have good governance, we don't have a rule of law, we don't have a good democracy, we don't have accountability, our institutions aren't capable, we have capture. But the reversal of this is not a demand to have those things. You don't say, actually, we need to have capable institutions, we need to get the capture out, we need to make everyone accountable, because those are exactly what you have just identified as the problem. So the solution to the problem is not to reverse the problem, because that becomes a tautology. So let's look at some of the interdependencies in the kinds of things that you are interested in, I'm also interested in, and then ask ourselves what might be a kind of set of strategies of identifying feasible and impactful policies, because that's what everyone is looking for. We all know what the problem is. We don't know what the solutions are. And a lot of solutions that have been offered, and actually collectively billions of dollars have been spent on all of these things: anti-corruption, accountability, building capabilities, building capacities in the state. The results are extremely poor, and that evaluation of what has been done is also necessary part of your setting the scene for the next stage of research. So take something as simple as a rule of law. What is a rule of law and how does it emerge? I mean, a lot of people look at the rule of law as itself a policy variable. We don't have a rule of law, so we need to have a rule of law. And if we don't have a rule of law, it's some intention of some rulers to not have a rule of law because they are thieves, right? Or they lack political will. And if we can enthuse them and put pressure on them from society, then they will start enforcing the rules, become accountable through a democracy and so on. But actually, if you ask yourself, what is a rule of law? It's immediately abundant. That is a very, very specific set of requirements, which structurally are very unlikely to be met in a developing country. What is a developing country? A developing country is a country where, by definition, you have many organizations in society that do not yet have the capability of running complex rule-following organizations. Now, what does that mean? It means that, in the typical developing country, 60, 70, or even 80% of activity is therefore informal. Now, informal in this sense means that you have organizations which don't even have the capability of registering themselves and meeting the transaction costs of being a registered entity, which means a certain level of annual reporting, of filing returns, of making, forget about meeting health and safety requirements and all the rest of it. Most organizations in a developing country don't have the capability to register themselves. Now, think of it for a second. 70 to 80% of your activity is happening by organizations which are not following rules. What does a rule of law mean in this context? Why is there a rule of law in more advanced countries? Well, a rule of law is not just that there are rules and people follow them. It's actually much more than that. A rule of law means that not only do you have rules, and not only are most people following them most of the time, if you are detected as violating that rule, then regardless of your connections and power and identity, you have the same probability of punishment as anyone else. So punishment is never 100% guaranteed, but you have the same probability of punishment as anyone else. Now you can see that even that is not absolutely ensured even in the most advanced rule of law countries, but it is closer to the mark. So a Goldman Sachs is more likely to be prosecuted and fined in the United States than the equivalent of a Goldman Sachs in India. Right? In India, a Goldman Sachs equivalent would not be fined. They would be very close to the prime minister. They would never ever get to the point where they would be fined $5 billion or even $5 million. Is it happening because people in the United States are more ethical, or that their systems are better, or their judges have more computers and technology of monitoring? No, it's happening because largely, and this is my position, it happens largely because in a place like the United States or in a North European country, you have thousands and thousands of organizations which have productive businesses from which they're making a lot of money and profit. And those businesses require contract enforcement for them to be viable. So you have a lot of powerful people who need contracts and rules to be enforced. Otherwise, they will not be viable. Okay? So while each of them wants to violate, everyone has a free riding incentive. As soon as you're detected as being a violator, no one is going to do business with you, because that threatens all of their contracts till you've made good and you've said, I'm sorry, and I've paid my fine. So everyone wants to avoid their tax, but as soon as you're detected as not having paid tax, there is no delay in correcting it, right? No one then says, okay, let's see what you can do. I'm not going to pay. That's because it's the self-interest of operating in a complex, heavily contractual society where there are tens of thousands of nameless people who don't know each other, who are doing business with each other, and all of them need third-party impartial enforcement to survive. That's what ensures the rule of law. So what ensures a rule of law is precisely an advanced country context of multiple sectors, tens of thousands of organizations, making collusion less and less possible. Now, I've said that this is under threat in advanced countries precisely because, as a result of the structural changes which have happened in the last 10 years, economic power has become more concentrated. And as economic power has become more concentrated, collusion has become possible, and that is threatening the rule of law even in advanced countries. But let's not go there. I think that's a different set of problems, and it's not yet there. As we saw with Trump, he was still blocked by many powerful organizations, from Google and Amazon to the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, who all went against this attempt at fixing the rules in a partisan way. It ended up with Congress being occupied, but it was at the last minute pushed back. So it was vulnerable. It could have gone either way, but it didn't go in the way of a capture. So what does it tell me? It tells me that the rule of law is not about having strong parliament and legislature and executive checking each other with rules. The question is, what makes those rules enforceable? Because to say that, we are going to now enforce the rules of anti-corruption or enforce the rules of checks and balances in politics, who is going to enforce the enforcers? So this fundamental question of who enforces the enforcer, you can set up another set of rules of an anti-corruption commission or courts and police, but who makes sure that the courts and the police and the anti-corruption commission are not going to use their powers to basically violate more rules as opposed to ensuring rules, actually requires a complex set of checks and balances in society, which takes a long time to construct, and that is, of course, development. So to me, some of the aspects of governance that we are talking about are actually outcomes of development. They can't be achieved as precursors of development to push development. So this is one idea to keep in your head. This is all an interactive endogenous system where some of the things we are describing are outcomes and some of the things are causes. Here is the real challenge. The very process of developing those capabilities and organizations and multi-sectoral development also requires rules to be enforced, also requires checks and balances. And so that very process of a non-rule of law society, which I describe in my work as a rule by law society. So we have rule by law societies, which means that there are rules, the rules are enforced, but they're not enforced equally with equal probability on everyone. So we are all variants of rule by law societies, depending on the configuration of internal power that describes what kinds of rule by law society you are, which could range from almost verging on anarchy and largely informal systems of enforcement to pretty strong, rule by law, but still the prime minister or the president is not subject to rules. So China would be an example of a really strong rule by law society, which is highly developmental, but is not rule of law. It's still rule by law, because no one can take Xi Jinping and say, have you followed the rules? And an African case would be a country like Rwanda, very, very different from China. But when people say Rwanda has a rule of law, they're mistaken. Rwanda has a very strong rule by law, but it doesn't have a rule of law for the same sorts of reasons. So this is our challenge. We are working in political settlements, and I define a political settlement as a particular configuration of power. And so we need to understand what that configuration of power is. We need to understand what is enforced and what is not enforced. And then, and this is the kind of really challenging research task, ask ourselves, what are the feasible interventions in this context? And so South Africa is very different from Malawi, right? So the contexts are completely different. So what is possible to be enforced in South Africa are therefore very much a part of that distribution of power, not just at the top in South Africa, but at the intermediate and lower levels as well, because a lot of rule violations happen at very low levels of economic and political activity where much of the action is. So actually just focusing on what is happening with the president or the prime minister is problematic. Much of the really important things are happening much lower down in society. When I say powerful, I don't mean powerful in identify the top 5% of organizations. Powerful means every issue, whether it is how you are distributing microcredit in a village context, to how you are giving industrial loans for industrial policy, or how you are allocating land in industrial zones for new investors. People might not be concerned about these issues, right? Because the rents involved are too small for them to be interested. But they are hugely contested at that level of society. And there are more powerful and less powerful people at every level, depending on the issue and the policy or the intervention that you are discussing. We need to understand that. We need to understand why policies are being inadequately implemented or distorted by those issues of power and competition over rents and resources, which are happening at every level of society. And here is where I think research and a governance agenda, which I would call a developmental governance agenda rather than a good governance agenda, which is trying to reproduce aspects of advanced societies in developing countries without looking at the endogeneity of many of these conditions. A developmental governance agenda, as I see it, is about saying, well, here is our starting point. Here is a configuration of power. what kinds of policies would trigger or nudge a change in behavior at the level of intervention that I'm interested in, which would have a better developmental outcome. And in the SOAS ACE anti-corruption research program, that is one of the research projects that I run, that is exactly the approach we take to anti-corruption. Because we argue that, if you have a society which is largely informal, where not only is a lot of the economic activity largely informal, a lot of the political activity, therefore, by necessity, is also largely informal, you can't have a anti-corruption approach which is about transparency, accountability, and enforcement, because this is meaningless. A transparency, accountability, enforcement approach assumes that 95% of people are already following the rules. You're just detecting a few people who are free riding. And as soon as they're caught free, that's a transparency. And as soon as you know who they are, that's the accountability. The enforcement will rapidly follow, because those people themselves will make amends, because they need to do that to survive. But if you're in a country where almost everybody is violating some rule or other, and almost everybody is largely informal or doing some activities based on connections and know-who and negotiating stuff for themselves, then identifying someone who is breaking rules has almost no effect, because it's random. Everybody could be picked up and they've violated some rules. Much more importantly, nobody else is going to rapidly come and give evidence, because everybody has something to hide. Many people will defend that person because they have been protected by that person in the past. We know all this, right? So this is happening in front of our eyes. It's not a clear-cut issue that we are all following rules. You have broken the rule. In a society where many people are breaking rules, many people are engaged in client list activity, many people are engaged in capturing rents, then the last thing you want is anti-corruption to become a fight between the government and the opposition, where the government simply picks up the opposition, who are all corrupt. No question about that. But then if you look carefully at who is the government, they are also corrupt. So this is not the way to do the anti-corruption or enforcement or capability development or strengthening anti-corruption commissions or using digital technologies. All of these things have been misused badly, and you need to look at the global evidence on this. So what do you do? So what we do is we ask a different question. And the different question is, how did societies which looked like us 50, 70, or 30 years ago, how did they build a broader and broader base of productive, complex organizations in the context where overall there wasn't good governance, there wasn't a rule of law, but nevertheless they kept building these organizations which grew, and the society became more and more complex, and those internal checks and balances developed, till suddenly at a point there were so many rule-following kind of islands that they began to connect up into a social rule-following behavior, which we call a rule of law. And that transition happened before our eyes in South Korea in the 1990s and 2000s, when it went from a high corruption, patronage-based society to a rule of law society, which could eventually impeach the president. Now, that a sitting president, not a president in the opposition, right? Now, that is the sign of a rule of law transition, which happened in front of our eyes. Now, how did that happen? And the answer is looking at us. It's happening now in China. It's happened before that in Japan. It happened in Taiwan. And before that, of course, in the UK and the United States. These societies did not become first rule of law and then developed. It was a sequential development of increasingly complex rule-following behavior, which at some point we can describe as a rule of law. And exactly that process is in a completely different intellectual frame and from a more liberal economics frame. And I come from a much more Marxist or materialist economic frame. But from a liberal economic frame, that is exactly what North Wallis and Weingast are describing in their limited access orders. And they're saying, look, these rent capturing violations are not some kind of pathology, it's not a political will absence or a disease. It's actually structural to how these societies are constructed. So they're saying the same thing, but from a completely different economic frame. So you also have to decide which economic frame you want to look at these problems for. But I agree with them on one thing: the absence of good governance is a structural problem which will only change when lots of things change in that society. So come back to SOAS ACE and our work on anti-corruption. So what do? Is we look at areas or activities in our countries of interest where in the same activity, we find some people are more productive and following rules, whereas other people are less productive and not following rules. And they're not less productive because they have lower economic power. So we're not comparing peanut sellers with, IT companies in the same activity. So, for example, we look at power stations of the same size, and why are some power stations built with the same technology and the same fuel much more cheaply in the same country at the same time than other power stations where there's collusion going on and the price is very high? Okay, and the same with skills providers, the same with doctors in the same country at the same time. Why are some people behaving in a more rule following way than others and being more developmental when they're otherwise absolutely similar in every respect? So we are comparing like with like. When we find such things, we get really excited because, and the answer usually is they're behaving differently because those people have some horizontal networks, exactly like you would find in a rule of law society, but now at a very microcosmic level. And their horizontal networks are forcing them to be rule abiding because someone they're dealing with, someone they're buying from, someone they're selling to, someone they're interacting with, someone who is monitoring at that level as they have, the rule following behavior by this party, and that is what keeps them honest. It's not culture, it's not signaling, it's not even enforcement from above, following rules. When we find that, and so this is our research agenda, we say, well, let's try to identify what's that difference in these horizontal networks, and is it feasible to replicate some of these horizontal networks for some of the others who are not following the rules properly? And if that is feasible, then we say this is the really feasible and effective policy answer. This is what policy should be doing. It's feasible because someone is already doing it. It is effective because it will change behavior. And this is really evidence-based research. And you have to really go down to that level to ask these questions, in my opinion, if you want to come up with policies which are implementable. In other cases, we find that there are some areas of corruption which are extremely anti-developmental, governance is failing, but where there are no such horizontal players, because it's a network corruption and everybody in a different way is benefiting from this corruption. And we have other examples of this in our research. And when this happens, we say, actually, there is no immediate feasible solution to this, but we need to think outside the box and come up with some completely different way of delivering the good or service that is in question to avoid some of the problems that this network capture is doing. So, and this, by the way, when the Chinese were, so we have some fantastic examples of this from Nigeria, where, for example, the Niger Delta artisanal oil refining is an example of network corruption. You have to find a solution outside it. But this is not just a problem of Nigeria. When you look at China and how China developed in the 1980s, there were areas which had intense network corruption, like in the public sector companies. And what did the Chinese do? The Chinese didn't say, we have to now have a big bang and reform our public sector. That would have blown up their society. They let those corrupt and inefficient, corrupt in this broad sense, right, of patronage-based over creation of jobs, that kind of corruption. So there was a lot of that in the Chinese public sector, but they didn't address that immediately. They went outside that and set up these new economic zones, which then created the capabilities which allowed them over 20 years to reform the public sector without the society blowing up. So we have these two strategies. One we call a voice enhancing strategy, that in sectors and activities where there is already some horizontal monitoring happening, we say, how do you enhance that voice? And in other sectors and activities in the same country, we would say, actually, there is no horizontal voice. We need an exit strategy which is delivering the same goods or services, but in a new way outside this network corruption that is now too difficult to solve. But we'll come back to it once we build the capabilities to do that. Now, when you come to that really top level corruption in countries, which is where we often always start, our position would be that's where you should end. That's not where you should start. Because when you get to the point of the prime ministers and presidents' corruption, the only way you can check that is if opposition parties and leaders of opposition have access to equally powerful networks of productive rule-following organizations who want a better rule of law being enforced because the violations of the president or the prime minister is harming their business. Now, when can that happen? That can only happen when you are a fairly productive, diverse society. So real checks and balances on the leadership happen even later, right? So the South Korean story is a very interesting point in that sense, right? So China isn't there yet. The Huaweis of this world might want a rule of law, but there are not enough of them to take on a Xi Jinping yet. But in 20 years' time, there might be so many Huaweis that they may say that actually our business model does require the executive to be under some constraints because we need to make contracts with global players. We need to make contracts with global networks, and they will not do business with us because they're afraid that the executive will ex post change those contracts, right? So China isn't there yet. If China isn't there yet, well, South Africa certainly isn't there yet, and Bangladesh certainly isn't there yet. While we should keep pressure on our political leaders, and we should threaten them with prosecution and all the rest of it, we shouldn't be depressed if that activity doesn't really change things dramatically in the end. It's something that we keep on doing, but it'll start to make a dramatic impact only when all these other substantive material changes in society have happened. And in the meantime, we have to work at the much less exciting intermediate levels and lower levels of changing those networks at which real capabilities are being built. So that's what my comment would be. And it's a challenge that I'm throwing out to you of taking your ideas, which are all excellent. You've identified exactly the right things, but I'm going to challenge you in your next few rounds of discussion to come up with a research agenda which is feasible, that is, you can implement it, that you will see changes immediately, not 200 years later, but immediately in 4 or 5 years' time. If you do this in the skills sector, if you do that in the primary school sector, if you do that, you will see outcomes which are going to be improved developmental outcomes. And by definition, you will have reduced resource leakage and you will have reduced the wastage, which we can describe as corruption. And you will be building those capabilities, which gradually over decades is going to make you a society with organic checks and balances, not artificially imposed checks and balances from above, which you can't enforce. And I think there's a lot of really important things that we can do at that level of practical activity, but it has to be based on really good theoretical research backed by really strong evidence. Otherwise, it becomes a wish list which can be interpreted in different ways and will not be implemented. So I think that you have taken a very giant leap in identifying a research agenda. I think that now you need to look at what different schools have been saying about these things because they're very well researched. Stick your neck out, take a position, and whether you want to say, I'm very welcome to say, you are wrong, Mushtaq. We can prosecute prime ministers and look, it has worked in those countries and they've changed things. Fine. It has to be evidence-based and it has to be implementable and it has to have an effective outcome. Let me end with a distinction which runs through a lot of the literature and is not very well thought through. My work is talking about capabilities, but capabilities are not to be confused with capacity and technical capacity. And this is something which is very often confused. People say, okay, Mushtaq is saying, we don't have capable organizations. Well, what we need to do is to have a program which improves these by bringing in technical training and skills training and capacity building. That's not the thing, right? Because those technologies and those trainings have to be really demanded by organizations that have the organizational capabilities of using them to become more productive in their own self-interest. This circuit is, I could give a whole lecture on that, and I have, but this is really important to understand, and this is itself an area of research. Let me give you an example of what happens if you ignore this. And the example I'll give you is the most dramatic thing that happened this year, and probably for many years, and that was the precipitated collapse of Afghanistan in 1 week. Afghanistan had a government which had been financed to the tune of about $2 trillion over 20 years, and much of that money had gone into so-called capability development. There were armies of consultants and contractors and TAs whose job was to improve the capacity of schools and hospitals and parliaments and electoral processes and the army and security. And what is now clear is that there was one critical thing missing in this whole package, which was the real effective demand on the part of the people who are being told, you have to build this hospital, this school, or this army unit, or this security. No one asked, are those people whom we are providing all these resources to, is there real effective demand on their part? Is this what they want to do? And the answer clearly was no, right? So with all their night visions and goggles and helicopters, when the Afghan army met lightly armed Taliban on motorcycles with Kalashnikovs, they handed over their weapons and went away. And it also turned out that much of the money that was spent on the army was spent on hiring ghost workers who weren't even ghost soldiers, who weren't even real soldiers. There were hospitals and schools that weren't working, but money was being pumped into it. There were no teachers or doctors. It was a massive Potemkin village. What this tells us in the most stark way, and in a more less dramatic way, this is happening in every developing country. Endless armies of TAs and capacity building and skills training and so on. No one is asking, are the powerful people at the local level, do they really want this school? Do they really want this hospital in their own self-interest? And are they going to work it? And the answer in many cases, not all, in many cases is no. And the answer in a few cases is yes. And we need to, and that's where it really works, is where there is that effective demand. That is that horizontal stuff that I'm talking about. We need to identify why that is happening in some cases and not happening in most cases. Just spending more money on capability development and systems and capacities and computers and digital isn't going to solve the problem. On that happy note, and I think there's a massively exciting research agenda here, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Professor Khan. My goodness, we thought we went through a process over the past few months to just sort of help us think through things, and we thought we were seeing some light. And then you come on and you shake it all up and you tell us, no, back to the drawing board, which is a good thing. I'm not dismissing that. I think it's definitely something positive. I think what's reassuring is that you're saying, the questions that's been asked are the important questions. However, we need to recognize they're not new questions. And so how we engage it and approach it is something which we need to grapple with as a team. And I suppose with all our partners as well.